Welcome to Conversation for Exploration. Hi, I'm your host, Laura Lee. One of the joys of this job over the past 12 years has been hearing from so many researchers in so many different fields to hear in depth their piece of the puzzle that they've been researching, and I sit in a great position here to see pieces being put down on the table in various sectors and then how all of this grand design fits together, especially in the field of ancient mysteries. Another joy is when some of those researchers get together on this show, and we'll have one such occasion here tonight. 3 of them. 2 of them have met before, almost on the show. They were, I think, next to each other in the guest lineup one night some years ago. That was Stephen Mehler and Chris Dunn. Stephen has been doing work with the indigenous elders of the Giza Plateau, the keepers of that very old line of wisdom, and looking at the underground waterways, long rumored. Finally, the evidence has come in to confirm that, and his new book is called
The Land of Osiris.
Just out. And Chris Dunn, a long-time frequent guest on this show, joins us again tonight, and his work has been looking for the power source. When Paul and I went to Egypt, we saw lots of evidence of machine tooling. We're not machinists like Chris Dunn is, but even we could recognize that artifacts in the pyramid there, in the museum there, that these were extraordinarily done, not with pounding balls. There was some tools going on there, on beyond copper. These were machined. We could see that. So quickly found out about Chris, invited him on the show, and Chris's book, The Giza Power Plant, explains just how the power source might have been to power some of those tools. Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm fine, Laura. It's a pleasure to be back talking to you.
Good to be back to you. And I understand you and Stephen met and have been collaborating for some time, and you found John Cadman, who's a maritime engineer who also joins us in our 4-way conversation here. And John has built a working model of a pump to explain how you get water from deep underground up to the Great Pyramid to then start doing who knows what, and we're going to try to sort some of those pieces out. John, how are you, and thanks for being here.
Hi, Laura. I'm doing really well. It's nice to be here.
So where do we begin with this story? Stephen, you're in studio.
Well, thank you,
set
Laura.
some groundwork.
Thank you, and you deserve a lot of the credit in this first section because, as you mentioned, I became aware of Chris Dunn's work perhaps in the mid-1990s. I think it was an article in Atlantis Rising that he had written on advanced machining. And I met a friend of yours at a conference in Newark, Delaware, arranged for me to be on a show in November of 1996 with you. And lo and behold, synchronistically, on the same night you were interviewing Chris Dunn. And that's the first time I ever heard him speak, and I was very impressed with him and his work. And another synchronistic event, we were invited to be on a closed-circuit TV show in Santa Barbara, California in February of 1997, and that's where we first met. And it was like an instant coming together. I mean, it's like we knew each other in past lives, if people want to go there. And it's just been, since then, we have become great friends and colleagues. And how it all becomes full circle here is Chris was invited to be a director of research of an organization that's formed by Dr. John DeSalvo, who you have interviewed, called the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association. And I then contacted John DeSalvo, and I became a director of research. And he said there was a gentleman that came along on board to be part of an advisory board, and that's John Cadman. And so that brings us all together. We are all on the advisory board of the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association. That's GizaPyramid.com. And now I've come here to a vacation to the Seattle area and have met John. And so now it's all come to circle. And Chris and I have gotten to the point where we've actually done a tour of Egypt together. So we've been in the field in May of 1999, and that's a fantastic adventure to be in the field with Chris Dunn, to be out there and see things through his eyes, to see him point out the machining, to see him point out the artifacts. And our combination of the fact that I am a prehistorian, archaeologist, theorist, and I have provided the cultural context. The greatest criticism that's been applied to a lot of the theories of alternative researchers and Chris's work is there's no cultural context. Where is the culture that could have produced advanced machining or advanced civilization? And through my work with the indigenous elder, Abdel Hakim, we now have the cultural context that there was a civilization prior to 10,000 years ago of indigenous people, very sophisticated, highly advanced in science, mathematics, and engineering. And so there's the framework that brings Chris's work out. And Chris's book, The Giza Power Plant, is the first major work that fits right in line with the indigenous teaching.
And John, you're building a working model of Kunkel's pump. I've also been intrigued by the Kunkel pump theory. Now, what's the update on that? Because I kept asking Stephen Mehler, you guys going to build a working model? You know, isn't it easy to put a few things together and get the angles right and get this and see if it works? And I understand you've finally done that.
I put it together. Actually, it's been running for about 2 years, a little over 2 years. And there were some parts of it which were really quite difficult to overcome. And one of the biggest things would be that there's very few good designs of the subterranean chamber, which is
a key part of this.
Yes, it is.
And Chris notes that in your book, Chris.
Yes. In the Giza power plant, the subterranean chamber, I theorize, actually held equipment that drove the entire pyramid to resonance, and in assistance with some of the other pyramids, actually drove the entire plateau to a vibratory resonance. And what that equipment looked like, I have no idea. I mean, one can speculate, but certainly somebody who actually develops a system, and I believe John has developed a system, and John, you can override me if you want. I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, I actually, back in '99, I had read Chris's book, and had come across part of what his theory was regarding the subterranean chamber creating the pulse or the pulsing frequency to drive the upper part of the pyramid, something of Tesla sort of nature. And in April of 2000, I finally built a working model of the basic pump assembly of the descending passage in the subterranean chamber. And the one thing I had noticed was that the subterranean chamber was absorbing the vast majority of a hydraulic hammer or a compression wave. And it was sending.
Can you explain what compression wave is in a hydraulic hammer?
Hydraulic hammer is an effect which occurs when moving water is stopped nearly instantaneously, basically the near instantaneous closing of a valve. And when that occurs, the water which is moving at a certain speed stops instantaneously, and when it does that, it compresses the fluid at the valve area, and it reflects back up from the water source. And what I had found was that the subterranean chamber, when it was absorbing the vast majority of this compression wave, and the compression wave has a tremendous force. I've calculated out to be something in the neighborhood of 21 million pounds of force, vertical force in the subterranean chamber. So it's a sizable force.
So how difficult would it be to accomplish that? Because that subterranean chamber is very odd. It's rough cut. It's got some sort of wall between it. It looks, and so many people have guessed, there's got to be a very specific purpose to this, but it doesn't look like any technology we're used to seeing. So would it be by specific design to do that? How difficult is it to accomplish that, what you're talking about?
It was a very, very difficult design in that it's a three-dimensional, it's very much a three-dimensional design, and not only does it incorporate fluid dynamics, it also incorporates acoustical dynamics.
Oh, how so? Can you both explain? All three? Explain that a little more.
Of course, that leads right into Chris's work when you say acoustical dynamics. So go ahead, Chris.
Well, I'm not going to steal John's thunder because the acoustics. If you look at any sound traveling through any medium, it is vibration. We know it as sound when it strikes our ears. But really, it's a wave that is traveling through a medium, whether it's through a
water
gas
or
a
air.
solid or a liquid.
Okay.
So the properties of the medium and also the dimensions that the medium is contained within would affect the characteristics of the sound or the vibration.
Why is it important to set up a vibration there, and what could it do?
To set up a vibration in the subterranean chamber could potentially cause the entire pyramid to, if that vibration is pulsed at the resonant frequency of the structure, then the structure will absorb that energy. It will maximize the throughput of that energy through the structure. So when you talk about, say, a harmonic resonance, you can actually, it's like a piano strings where you strike one and at an octave higher, another string will vibrate in sympathy. It maximizes the absorption of energy.
Because if you map out a resonant bunch of frequencies, the lows all match up, the highs all match up, and so they're building. That was Tesla's whole principle. If you get them to match up,
exactly,
you build up strength.
Basically, what I was leading to was that Tesla actually demonstrated the effect of this phenomenon, and
creating the earthquake in New York.
Built an earthquake, yeah, an earthquake machine, right.
You think, what can a few sound waves do? Well, quite a lot if you engineer it correctly.
Right, and so it's like, if you take say a huge 1-ton iron ball that's hung from a chain from the ceiling, you go up to it with you calculate how much energy it's going to take to move that ball from point A to point B, say a 3-foot swing. And so you calculate how much energy it takes to overcome inertia and move that mass. You could have a considerable amount of energy involved in the hammer that you're going to use to strike it. However, a child could walk up to that huge ball and just give it a little push, and it won't move very much, but it will move, and then it will move back to her, and then she can push it some more. And so every time the pendulum swings back to that child and energy is applied to it, the ball will swing further. And so with less energy, you can actually affect a greater amount of work by moving the ball further than what you normally could if you were just going to strike it.
There's other indications that resonance was part of the mechanics of the solid-state machine as you've described it, Chris, because the King's Chamber is so set for particular resonance. There's so many indications that it was...
Yes. And I understand, too, that you recently had an acoustics engineer, John Reed, on your...
John Reed, fascinating work.
Yes.
He stretched a drum across the sarcophagus, he set up tones, and he found hieroglyphic shapes forming in the sand, a la Hans Jenny's cymatic experiments.
And I haven't, I'm going to buy his book from your bookstore, but I'm fascinated to read his work.
Yeah.
Because I know that in my book, I think from what I read on your website, that he noted that the whole chamber resonated at around 440, and also the granite box. I call it a granite box. A lot of people call it a sarcophagus,
which is a misnomer.
But they resonated at 440.
So you have this other chamber above that's geared to accept resonance at a particular frequency and do interesting things with it. We'll get to that in a moment. But you mentioned that it's pulsing at a resonance frequency. And John, how does the pulse happen? Does this valve close on and off so that you get a pulse? Because it's very important to set up a resonance, right?
Right. Yeah, the valve opens and closes after the initial opening of the valve, which would have been down somewhere in front of the Sphinx, down in the Lake Hathor or the Nile. Once that valve is opened, it starts to pump assembly starts to run up by itself. It takes over.
How does that happen?
It has to do with the initial compression wave, and right after the compression wave, there's a rarefaction wave, which
rarefaction wave. You want to explain that?
Which is basically the opposite of a compression wave. It's a negative pressure wave. It directly follows the compression wave. But when that rarefaction wave leaves the valve area, it actually reopens the valve. And so it's ready to eventually have water pass by it and close it again.
How does it get pulsed at a particular frequency so it's beat, beat, beat? Is it to do with the size, the materials, the opening, the initial setting? How does it?
That's a very interesting question. That it has a lot to do with everything you said: the size of the valve, the material of the valve, the amount, the distance that the valve moves, and whichever surface that it strikes has everything to do with all those. But what I've found is that in the subterranean chamber itself, it was designed by way of the room's height being a split level room. Half of the chamber would resonate at 440 hertz, and then the other half would be 880 hertz, which is double the 440.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. So coordinated with the King's Chamber.
Yes, it is.
And I saw a working demonstration today of John's model, and I was very impressed. And I think the pulsed frequency is very important. In fact, Teresa, my lady, commented that when he first turned it on, it sounded like a heartbeat.
Boy.
And it puts out a tremendous pulse. The model that I have has a Schedule 40 PVC pipe, which is a semi-flexible sort of pipe, and that's used in the passageway. And in the full-scale model on the Giza Plateau, that would have been incorporated solid limestone, which is very non-flexible, and the amount of pulse, the hammer effect, would have been just tremendous. This particular model will very easily, I know it would shake the whole pyramid all by itself without having to multiply the pulses.
So the PCV pipe being flexible absorbs some of the effect, but the granite, obviously, rock solid, wouldn't.
Right.
How big is your working model?
It's on a scale of 1 to 48, so it's a quarter inch to the foot. I have the subterranean chambers 6.5 inches by 11 inches.
How would you model the subterranean chambers? It's not like you have a recipe like you could do with the King's Chamber.
I went mainly by Petrie's measurements and a lot of photographs.
A lot of irregular surfaces there.
Yes.
Was that so important, or was it just the basic dimensions of it that's important in the material?
The irregular surfaces are also critical in that they create a really complex three-dimensional water flow, which
Oh, with a lot of eddies and whirlpools and that kind of
Absolutely.
thing. So just like in our studio, we put baffling on the sides of the walls to absorb the sound, so it's not bouncing around in a small chamber. Would that have a similar effect, a baffling in effect, the irregular surface?
It has a lot to do with the fluid dynamics as opposed to the acoustical dynamics.
Fluid dynamics, you're a maritime engineer. This is something you've studied. Give us a bit of insight on that.
The way they've channeled all of the various flows, the fluid flows within the chamber. An instance is one of the flows, which comes from the channel. There's a channel in the upper, well, it's the middle of the step area within this subchamber. The flow that comes out of that actually redirects another particular flow so that it minimizes erosion and without lost for words.
So it's stable.
Complex flow design.
Wow. Where would the water come up? Because, Stephen, you've written about these waterways. We've seen evidence of the tunnels big enough to walk in, tunnels that were highly engineered, a vast system of tunnels, plumbing under the Great Pyramid,
Absolutely.
bringing in. Where would it meet up with the subterranean chamber?
Well, John and I were talking about this earlier. There happens to be a tunnel, a chamber entrance that goes into the subterranean chamber, which, of course, the Supreme Council of Antiquities has put a lock on and a gate. Drunville and Melchizedek has spoken about this. I believe that tunnel is coming from the Sphinx. So as John has mentioned...
the valve would be at the Sphinx.
Yes, and probably from Lake Hathor, as he mentioned. We know that the Sphinx sits in her own hollow. It was hollowed out when she was carved, and the blocks used to build the structures in front of the Sphinx. So Hakim has always mentioned that once the Sphinx was completed, she sat on a waterway, on her own lake. So, and with the underground tunnels and that water system, we believe that's where it's coming in, and I think John's model will eventually show that.
Aesthetic technology.
Yes.
It looked pretty while it sat there doing its job.
Absolutely, all functions at once.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to add to this?
Well, I would be interested in it. I'm jealous of Stephen for actually seeing the model. I'd like to see it myself.
We have to get you here.
Yes, certainly. And, what basically, I guess if we could look at the what John has done and how you introduced him, Laura. I know that you introduced John and his work as being a Kunkel's pump.
Oh, let's just clarify that.
Yeah, and I was under the impression that John's work has diverted somewhat from Kunkel in terms of how he explains the upper chambers. Is that correct, John?
Oh, that is so correct. It has very, very little to do with Kunkel's work. In fact, I had originally tried Kunkel's design, and in my model, it didn't work.
Interesting. But interesting that Kunkel got onto water and pump, even though he didn't get it right.
Yes, I give him credit for that. He definitely introduced the whole design.
I always thought water shooting out the top of the pyramid was rather absurd.
I thought it was quite absurd.
Yeah.
And it doesn't explain all the other evidence in the upper chambers.
Yeah.
So that's where, that's what I had a problem with.
So you went back to the basic designs of the Great Pyramid and said, now how would this translate into a working pump? Tell us that process, John.
Oh, my. I actually had just done the subterranean section, and so you could eventually remove the whole pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And what I had found was, I'd originally left off the well shaft. I'd originally believed that had been added after the pyramid had been running.
The well shaft, could you?
The well shaft being a shaft leading from the bottom of the descending passage up to the junction of the ascending passage and the horizontal passage at the Queen's Chamber. And it's just a very strange shaft which has, some people believed it was built as an inspection shaft or removing people or all sorts of odd explanations. And And after studying the subterranean chamber for an extended amount of time, probably 8 to 10 months, I finally realized that the pit, which is kind of a square shaft that drops about 11 feet down in the floor of the subchamber, that it had originally extended down further, and that pit shaft extended out to an area somewhere around the Sphinx, which coordinated nicely with what the indigenous teachings said about there being a tunnel from the Great Pyramid up to the Sphinx area. So I tried that basic layout and assumed that the dead end shaft, which it's a 2-foot square shaft that leads 57 feet, somewhere around 57 feet, into Never Never Land. Well, it just stops abruptly. That the flow had exited through the dead end shaft. And the original model incorporated that particular design, and around all the pyramids, it's pretty accepted that there was a retaining wall of some form. That's relatively, it's even accepted by the Orthodox camp.
And what were those walls retaining?
Yes. So I had to agree with Kunkel that the retaining walls had something to do with retaining water, and the walls would have to be approximately 60 feet high to allow water to drop down into the descending passage.
Well, a couple questions, and then let's get back to piecing together what this technology might have been. So many people are looking for a hall of records under the Sphinx unless they used waterproof containers. It seems that there were some very different uses for those chambers then, would one assume?
Well, if I could address that, when I first spoke about a hall of records to my teacher, Abdel Hakim, maybe 1997, he poo-pooed the whole idea. He didn't support the idea of a hall of records. And basically he said that we are the hall of records. He said the memory of who we are and what we were before is encoded in our DNA, as Greg Braden says, and that we only have to wake up to this knowledge. So he was not supportive of the fact, that doesn't mean that there may not be a chamber under the Sphinx that may have some evidence. I don't think it will be papyrus scrolls, as people tend to think.
It's a very technology.
Exactly. I think it will be some of the evidence that Chris is talking about. I think they're going to be schist plates. They're going to be stonework that's going to be part of maybe the apparatus of the machines that were used. But Hakim's emphasis to me has been since the beginning of our work that the majority of the tunnels under all the sites, not just on the Giza Plateau, I speak of many sites in my book, which we call the Land of Osiris, all connected by tunnels, were primarily to bring water to the sites for energy.
It's interesting that in Mexico, at Teotihuacan, there was also waterways and lakes, man-made ponds, whatever, around the pyramids of the sun and the moon. One wonders.
We think, again, I speak of what we call the global maritime culture, which existed over 10,000 years ago. As previous guests that you've had, David Hatcher Childress and Gunnar Thompson have said, the oceans were highways, not barriers. So I think a lot of this knowledge was shared around the world, was not just exclusive to one people.
So just a point about water. Whales communicate by setting up resonant frequencies that travel if they can get the specific temperature and depth. It can travel miles across the oceans. So my point being that water is a very good medium for certain types of waves to propagate and with a lot of force. It doesn't lose energy like sound waves do through the air as much. Am I correct, Chris?
I was going to say that's so correct.
Oh, good. You're the
I would agree with that. I was hoping that John would, being the maritime engineer, would field that question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I meant I can't see either of you guys, okay? But I can hear you. So tell me a little bit about that. And if you were going to build such a machine, water's a very good way to deliver some of the oomph of the whole machinery, right, John?
Yeah, it would be similar to transferring of electricity through copper wires.
Okay.
Transfer a compression wave, which is a really extremely powerful force, through a water tunnel. So it's a very efficient way to transfer energy.
Because you can do a lot with very little. I was asking our friend Gary Hawkins, who told us about Brown's gas years ago. You take some water and you separate out the gas into oxygen and hydrogen. Going, Gary, how much of electricity do you need to do that? He said 1 or 2 volts. I said, well, the clay jar batteries we were just talking about, they produce a half a volt each. He said, oh yeah, you can hook a bunch of those up together. You can get your several volts. That's all you need to make this stuff. I'm going, okay, it could have been done, right?
And that's true.
Possibly. I mean, if you're clever, you don't need a lot to do a lot of work.
Right.
I mean, you can use simple materials.
Well, I think that the evidence clearly shows, to me anyway, that the ancient Cometians, or Egyptians, were very, very skilled in their technology, very knowledgeable, and that the system that they built at Giza was what I would consider to be a very holistic system in terms of transferring one kind of energy to another kind of energy. And the work that John is doing in introducing water into the equation, which was something that I had not really considered, makes more sense to me as I think about it, because water would impart more force on the structure than just a sound wave moving through air. So, I applaud him for his effort and his enthusiasm, especially in actually building a working model.
John, because water weighs so much more than air, and so it can push better and can, push against the sides of the granite and set up that resonant frequency better, or what? What is the qualities here?
Air is compressible, and water, most fluids are just slightly compressible. And so if there was air within the subterranean chamber, then it wouldn't transfer compression waves well, or it wouldn't work.
Oh, it would go towards compressing the air that's in the chamber rather than pushing against the granite. Mm-hmm.
Right, and that was one thing that Kunkel had originally said, was that the subterranean chamber was some sort of air compression chamber.
Mm-hmm. Wrong.
And the evidence just does not support that. There's significant water erosion throughout the chamber, and it demonstrates that it was completely water saturated.
What are the signs of the water erosion in that subterranean chamber?
There's a lot of wear.
Mm-hmm.
So it shows that it did run, and it did run for a significant period of time.
Would that be one reason why it was discontinued or got out of whack when enough material was taken away out of the chamber? Did it get less accurate?
I really couldn't say.
I don't believe so.
From what I've seen from Chris's work and what I've encountered, that it had something to do with the upper chambers.
And some explosion probably derailed it.
And actually, Chris was the first one to postulate this, and I have gone back since Chris's book has come out and checked in the Grand Gallery and in the King's Chamber, and I am totally in support of Chris's idea that some sort of accident explosion occurred in the Great Pyramid. And Chris, you could elaborate on that.
Yes, there's quite a lot has come to the surface, Laura, since we talked, in terms of additional research and also vindication for some of the proposals that I made in the Giza power plant. One was the location of the what I called resonators in the Grand Gallery, which explained the existence of the slots that were in the ramps that run on both sides of the gallery.
Mm-hmm.
And I've postulated that these resonators there was 27 banks of resonators that were actually tuned to the frequencies coming through the pyramid.
So they transfer the resonance from water to air?
They transferred it from the limestone to air.
Right.
Okay, gotcha. Oh, I see.
One thing I'd like
water to limestone to air. Okay. Go ahead.
I'd like to add is that water the highest point it would have gone would be to the floor of the Queen's chamber, and just that'd be the total elevation of any water within that structure. So it has very little to do with the actual Queen's chamber or King's chamber.
Gotcha. Okay.
So the proposal that I made was the destruction of what caused the Great Pyramid to shut off
down.
Was a catastrophic failure that caused an explosion within the King's chamber. It caused some of the noted phenomena that we find in the King's chamber, such as the walls being expanded over an inch. Normally, in an earthquake, things collapse. They tend to fall in on themselves. They don't expand. Also, the giant granite beams, of which there are 5 layers above the King's chamber, were caused to crack along the south end. I also proposed, and those were actually observed by previous researchers, and they're available in books by Howard Vise, Peter Tompkins' book, Piazza Smythe's book, Our Inheritance of the Great Pyramid. So these were all noted phenomena by early researchers. What I proposed was also that it has been long speculated that within the Grand Gallery there were certain pieces of equipment, or there were certain devices, and the question was, what happened to these devices? We know that early explorers coming into the Great Pyramid were faced with a tremendous amount of rubbish that they cleared out. A lot of stone was dropped down the well shaft. A lot of stone was dropped down the descending passage, and eventually had to be cleared out in later years. But what I speculated was that the explosion that occurred actually caused the destruction of these resonators in the Grand Gallery. And by a tremendous fire that caused them to burn up, and that there would be evidence that would support that. Well, when I was in Egypt in 1999 with Stephen, we were inside the Grand Gallery, and it was only when we were doing some video inside the Grand Gallery, and it was only when they actually turned on the camera lights that I noticed on the wall a tremendous scorching on the walls of the Grand Gallery. And they were on each overlap. As you know, in the Grand Gallery, they have what they call a corbelling, where the walls step in about an inch and a half per side as they reach the ceiling. They go from 82 inches wide at the bottom to 42 inches wide at the top, and that's over a 28-foot height. That each of the steps that comes in as you look up the gallery wall towards the ceiling, there were these scorch marks and places where you could see that the stone was clearly burned and scorched, and in some places it actually flaked off.
And if I could interject, Chris, you also discovered in May of 1999 that the upper wall of the Grand Gallery is granite, not just the King's Chamber, and these scorch marks are in granite.
That's correct, yes. And as you get close to the King's Chamber, there is a transition of material from limestone to granite. That every piece of literature that I had read prior to observing that did not refer to any granite being in the Grand Gallery.
Right.
So that was new to me, and that was quite an exciting discovery. But more exciting to me was that right over the slot, if you take a straight line down the wall and take that line through each of the scorch marks, it landed right in the slot on the ramp on the gallery floor. So whatever burned, whatever caused that vitrification, that scorching on the stone, was oriented in the Grand Gallery over the slot in a vertical orientation, which is precisely what I had illustrated in my book. And the next observation that I made actually came 2 years later. It was last year, after they had closed the pyramid for a year and they had done some cleaning. And I know there were a lot of rumors on the internet that was just a ruse. But indeed, when I went into the pyramid, I noticed that they had done a considerable amount of cleaning inside the Great Pyramid. Mm-hmm. And what that cleaning had revealed on the ceiling of the Grand Gallery were scorch marks on the ceiling on both sides of the gallery, in just the places where you would see the support structure of the resonators that I had illustrated in my book. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to have those photographs up on my website, so listeners can go to www.gizapower.com and click on the links. I have several articles up there, updates since my book was published, so they can read about that material and also look at the photographs.
Okay, a couple of questions. So these resonators would be made out of some flammable material?
Well, there's speculation that they're actually crystal, and it could have been such tremendous heat or the explosion that destroyed them completely.
This ties into my second question. Edgar Cayce talks about the Atlanteans having a crystal that goes out of whack, and my earlier question about maybe so much material came out of the subterranean chambers to start the resonance being a little bit off, therefore that it wasn't quite in resonance with the king's chamber. Would that be enough over time to throw the whole thing out of whack so then it could start to, would that be enough to create explosion? What would? Sabotage? What can you imagine, Chris, that would create such an explosion?
Well, what I believe created it was a meteor strike, because the damage that we see in Egypt is not just inside the Great Pyramid. We see it all over Egypt, the Pyramid of Meidum, at Saqqara, at Abu Ghurab, Abu Rawash. There are signs that there was a tremendous destruction. And I'm going to explain why I believe that it was an outside force or an external force that caused this destruction. Because we have a system that relies on Earth energies to operate. It maximizes the throughput of energy from the Earth. Now, when we're working with a closed system, such as our ecology, our environment is a closed system, and we have a system that's maximized to have throughput or energy from that system, and then there is an influx of energy. Yeah. The system that we have should be, if it can't transfer that energy or move that energy away in a rapid manner, then it's liable to just destroy itself. It becomes what they call a runaway vibrator. It can't handle the energy that is being pumped into it.
So would it create an explosion of that magnitude? Would it create?
Well, I think then what you have to look at is probably a chain of events. Mm-hmm. And so in the systems or the device, the Great Pyramid device, as I call it, the machine, if you would have certain devices that work on the outside of the pyramid as well as the inside, because we're working with a gas within the pyramid that is also in harmonic resonance with the pyramid and with the Earth, with the universe. We're talking about hydrogen gas, a very flammable gas. Because we're working with that kind of gas, the introduction of oxygen into the system, sparks that would set it off, would cause a huge explosion. So when we look at a chain reaction, we see that there is a huge influx of energy. The pyramids, being so finely tuned to the frequency of the Earth, cannot handle that energy. And so they literally start shaking apart. With the Great Pyramid, whatever equipment is located on the outside to contain the gases and make the system work is shaken off. And so then we have an introduction of gases into the system, into the pyramid. From there, you have another chain reaction on the inside with an explosion. The chamber is expanded over an inch. The vitrification inside the King's Chamber, the vitrification in the Grand Gallery. All of these...
Discoloration of the stone box.
Exactly, the discoloration of the stone box. Thanks for bringing that up, Stephen. All of these things were a part of this chain reaction when the disaster struck.
So how would you make a computer model or some sort of, I can't really see a working model with this, but have you gone to physicists and said, working with these gases and these properties of resonance and pulsing and all of that, how far have you looked into this to see what gases, what combination, what were they doing with it? How do you turn that into some sort of usable power for the machine tools that left their mark on all of those artifacts?
Right. The computer modeling, of course, is outside my capabilities. I don't have the resources to do that. Mm-hmm. I have been in communication on several occasions with different people who have expressed an interest. Unfortunately, nothing has panned out yet for one reason or another.
But you're open to somebody coming forward and saying, this is my field and let me...
I just want somebody to come forward and say, okay, I believe in this. I think we could model this. Let's do it. Mm-hmm. But it's going to be very time-consuming, and it's going to be expensive because of the computer hardware and software that you would need to do it. Though I believe that our PCs are becoming so powerful now that a lot of the modeling software could run on a PC.
And wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a country or a climate in which alternative energy, which makes so much sense these days, were one of our goals? And some companies swooped down and said, hey, we're looking for R&D ideas. We've got plenty of funds, plenty of folks to work on this. We need a working model to save the world. We'll try anything. See how far we get.
Well, you can be sure if it has a military application, they're already working on it.
Well, that's a good point.
Well, we know. Some people tend to think when we talk about anti-gravitics or things like this, a lot of people poo-poo it. But the fact is that our government's been working in anti-gravitics research for 30 or 40 years. And so this is something that has, again, if it has some sort of military application, they're interested.
Yeah. So, John, what do you think? You're an engineer. About Chris's description of the rest of the
I agree with him totally.
Because?
Because it makes sense with what evidence is there.
Yeah.
Chris goes by evidence, and that is something I really appreciate.
If I could comment on that, and thank you, John, I appreciate that. What I have said in my book, and I still maintain, is that John will understand as an engineer that anytime you propose a device or a machine that will perform useful work, you cannot come right out of the box with a perfect working model. There's always development. There's R&D. Something doesn't work. You have to try something else. And so I have never been, a real hard-nosed stickler that says that my ideas are the only ones that are correct. I think that basically if there is an alternate, a different view, then it has to explain the evidence. And because we're looking at the pyramid as an entire system, everything has to fit within the same context. And that's where Egyptology has failed, in my opinion, because every explanation for every feature is a forced theory.
Right.
Yeah. Well, what's beautiful about this design that you're describing is that they bring the water up, and we see the tunnels for that, and big tunnels. Why else would you need such big tunnels and so many of them? And then the water is a great medium, John, as you were pointing out, for delivering powerful resonant waves.
Right.
And then also the material. I'm assuming you're talking about separating the water into hydrogen and oxygen, right?
Right. There's some evidence which would strongly suggest that that was one thing that occurred within the subterranean chamber.
What is the evidence for that?
There's some erosion patterns which match some sort of gas being present.
This is one reason why we have to get John to Egypt, to get him down in the subterranean chamber, because he believes there's evidence of gas erosion, which would establish that the gases were produced in the subterranean chamber.
How do you recognize gas erosion on rock as opposed to water erosion?
It leaves us different patterns. If there's some sort of air bubbles or gas of various forms.
So how would they separate it? How do you take water being pumped up and it's being pulsed and it's slapping against that granite? How do you go from that to separating into the two components of gas?
Well, within the subterranean chamber, there's what's a limestone environment, which is highly volatile to begin with. And
how is limestone highly volatile?
Well, it's reactive.
Oh, okay, because of its chemical composition.
Correct.
Okay.
Calcium carbonate.
Right, and combine that with there's a tremendous velocity, fluid velocity, going against this particular medium, plus got a compression wave that's reverberating within the room. Plus, there's also in the rarefaction wave, the rarefaction wave is a negative pressure, and it's quite possible that would cause cavitation within the subterranean chamber on the ceiling.
So it would accumulate, the separated gases would accumulate on the ceiling?
It would accumulate in one particular spot, which eventually it would end up in the most westerly section of the particular room. And I strongly believe that there was a small tunnel that went from the subterranean chamber to the...
And gas rises?
Yes.
So it would just naturally find its way up to the Queen's chamber.
Right.
This is so brilliant. It's like get the materials to do the work for you.
And then
wow.
Any form of overflowing water being perked up into the Queen's chamber would run down the hallway and back down into the well shaft.
Okay, so it's self-correcting.
Right.
And self-cycling.
Right.
Okay. Oh, boy. Anything else? Because we have just 2 minutes. What do you want to say in way of conclusion to this? I want to continue.
It was nice meeting Stephen today. Stephen.
Yeah.
It was. And
nice meeting you, John.
Yeah.
This is just a further example of what's happening in the world, as you know, and our group, the Great Primitive Giza Research Association, has a group of international scientists bringing all these theories together, and it's great if we can all get together and share this work and get funded to do these models, because John is on the way. We want Chris to have a working model, and we can demonstrate these principles to the world.
That's what I love about independent research. So, no agendas, but looking at the evidence and seeing where it honestly leads. Thank you all.
There's a lot of evidence over there to look at.
Yes, there is.
Don't you wish you've had that debris field, these shattered, burnt crystals here? And
you've been to Egypt, Laura. You've seen the evidence, and
with my unaided, educated eye, I could see that. Yeah.
I should mention too that in January, Stephen and I will be attending a conference in Cairo and leading a tour. So we'll be showing folks the evidence and actually demonstrating some of the technologies of the ancient Egyptians in terms of how they created such precise objects.
Boy, exciting research. Thank you. And who knows, we may end up with some form of alternative energy that could be useful today and replace fossil fuels. Why not take the wisdom of the ancient and apply it today where we can and make the world a better place? That's one of the intriguing factors to this, not just understand our ancients and how sophisticated they were and how brilliant they were, but also to have some insight into how we can work with nature for our own enhancement and that of the rest of the planet. We continue this hour with our 3 researchers on ancient Egyptian technology: Stephen Mehler, new book Land of Osiris; Chris Dunn, Giza Power Plant; and John Cadman, maritime engineer who's built a working model of a pump based on the subterranean chambers of the Great Pyramid. We've all come together for part 2 of our discussion to continue just how the solid-shaped machine that the Great Pyramid looks to be would turn water into energy. What we established in the first hour was that Kunkel had the idea that the pyramid was getting water to it, but that's about as far as it went. John Cadman's produced a much more accurate and, very importantly, working model based on the subterranean chambers. Stephen Mehler has worked with indigenous elder Hakim looking for those waterways and documents all that evidence of an earlier Nile to the west, so we can date this technology way, way, way back. As Hakim says, this indigenous society says it goes back. We don't need to invoke aliens or Atlanteans. Human beings could devise this stuff. And there was the water, thus, in the way that the water got up to the Great Pyramid. Chris Dunn has looked at evidence for machine tooling in many of the artifacts. Stone balls can't do this stuff. So what were the tools and what powered them? In the last hour, I mentioned Brown's gas because I wanted to make the point that it doesn't take a lot of energy to separate hydrogen and water. This wasn't Brown's gas, however, that this water was being separated into. Chris, you're saying it was hydrogen. And what I was amazed last hour too, John, was when you painted a picture of how simple it would be to bring water up with the right materials, the right chamber, the right pulsing, the right everything, so that the gas naturally separated itself, was funneled up into the Queen's chamber, and ergo, you didn't have to introduce some outside source of electricity. The materials itself, physics, nature, this was all engineered so that nature would do this process quite naturally. It was stunning.
Amazingly simple design.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that? And I want to hear from Chris. What do you do with a bunch of hydrogen that's resonating at the right frequency? How, to further detail out, and for all of us non-scientists in the audience, take us along on this path as you continue to paint this picture, if you all will.
Oh, is that a question for me, Laura?
General question, whoever wants to take it. I don't mind over-talking. This is a four-way conversation.
You know, Laura, every time we give a presentation on this, the standard 1A question is, what did they use the energy for? People think of only in terms of their modern ethnocentricity. We know we have power plants. We know we have electricity. We know we have devices where we need energy. But people can't conceive of a so-called primitive or prehistoric society having a need for energy.
But there's many points on the electromagnetic spectrum.
Well, I mean,
our form of energy is one tiny slice of it.
Absolutely. But it's a basic question that every biological system, every system that's developed needs an energy input to create itself, to duplicate itself, to continue itself. So energy, again, Chris, we'd like you to address this. What did they use the energy for?
Yes, and I think that what I'd like to say to that, Stephen, I'm glad you brought that up. A lot of, as you can imagine, Laura, I think we go back to 1995, when I was first interviewed by you. But since that time, and especially since my book came out, there's been a lot of detractors of the Giza power plant. And one of the slick comments that people tend to make is, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Right. And because the way the book was kind of advertised, it was, well, what drove the machines? Chris Dunn has developed a theory about the Great Pyramid being a power plant. And
then they're going to say what machines? Mm-hmm.
And so then they come, okay, well, the machines built the pyramids powered the machines, and so they don't understand the basic concept that we build power plants today, and we use machine tools, and we don't need...
Another concept the ancients had was they enhanced their own biocircuitry, the electrical circuitry of the body. We don't pay attention to that so much unless you go into alternative modalities. The megalithic people used earth energy, I believe, in this way as well. Higher states of consciousness, mystical experiences, being in tune with the web of life, all of that. So if you can find a power output to drive whatever made those drill cores that Petrie talked about, that you document so well, Chris, and enhance your own biocircuitry, then you have harmonious technology, not the mess we have today. But I just wanted to add that point. Proceed, please.
Well, you've hit the nail right on the head.
Absolutely.
As far as
it was well stated.
As far as where my research is taking me, because what I am seeing currently is that they did have a multi-dimensional purposes, the pyramids, not just to provide energy in the form of electricity, power to power whatever devices that they had back then, but also to create environmental changes that a human living within that environment would benefit from.
Well, not just the humans, but look at, growing plants and agriculture and, the birds and the bees and everything else would be enhanced. The very air that you breathe would vibrate to a more life-enhancing frequency. The life force that you live with, the ecstasy you would feel every day.
And the interesting thing is that I had been in contact. I've received thousands of emails over the last 4 years, and one of the most interesting emails that I received and the conversations that I engaged in was with a woman by the name of Susan Alexander. And Susan is a composer, and she has worked with a biophysicist who had actually mapped the frequencies of the DNA. And she contacted me because she had read in my book about the frequencies of the King's Chamber and forming an F-sharp chord. And guess what? They are the same frequencies that we find within our own DNA. So we have this harmonic system that we're a part of. Our bodies resonate to these frequencies. The earth resonates to these frequencies. And there are systems outside of the earth that resonate to those frequencies too. So when everything is in harmony, life is perfect. I mean, how can you, if you're in tune with your own body, if you're in tune with the earth and in tune with the universe, then you have universal consciousness and connectivity. And I think that the frequencies that resonate with parts of the brain that will actually stimulate certain glands in the brain that would give you a feeling of connectivity with all that is, the universe, if you will. And so it is a multi-dimensional device or devices, and the picture to me now is a lot richer than what it was when I wrote my rather technical tome back in 1998. So,
well, the whole body is a brilliant machine, and every technology that I think was ever produced is a pale imitation of what nature already does. And so if you can look at the insights of nature, as Victor Schauberger and Tesla and so many geniuses have done, and actually produce that kind of technology, and think how far ahead of the game we would be in terms of enjoying our life while we're busily changing the world and, going power mad and all of that. We could really use power, what it's truly meant to be, life force, harnessed life force.
Well, actually, to bring back to a little Egyptology into it, one of the symbols that Hakim was really adamant in teaching me is a symbol called Nefer. I discussed that in my book. The Egyptologists have translated it as good or beautiful, but he came up with the translation harmony. And what does he say basically the Nefer sign represents? It represents our trachea, voice box, and the lobes of the lungs. Why? Because he says that's where we produce sound in our body, and that's where we produce harmony. So again, we're saying, and this was brought up in a presentation I gave the other night at a book signing, you cannot divorce the consciousness of the person that's involved with the machine, with the experiment, etc. We know this in quantum physics now, that the consciousness of the observer affects the observed, affects the experience. So that we're talking about people who in a high state of consciousness using sound through their body to also produce this energy with the machines, with the stone.
We're part of the circuitry.
Absolutely. The human element was part of the machine.
So you can imagine people getting around and toning in ritual and singing and drumming and dancing and the whole thing as part of the activation. And the machine would feed them and they would feed the...
Talk over. One of the misconceptions that I run into, and Stephen can concur with this, is that there seems to be some kind of a dichotomy, if you will, where if you are spiritual, you are non-materialistic and you eschew technology and industry.
Right.
And if you are a technologist or you're involved in creating technology, then you don't have a spiritual side.
Well, that's the technology as we do it today. There's a good reason to eschew it.
That's why it's out of balance.
Yeah.
But it's not always that true. I mean, even the technology, the way...
Well, we are technology, right?
Yes.
We have inner technology. That's
correct.
Our human heritage. That's what connects us to higher states. Yeah.
Yes, and I think, though, that the people who are involved in technology on a daily basis should be recognized for their spiritual side, too. Because certainly one thing that I have been faced with is that when we look at the ancient Egyptians, and a lot of people look at the ancient Egyptians as their spiritual civilization that was devoted to their gods and the afterlife, and to imagine that they would actually be engaged in commerce and technology horrifies a lot of people.
I guess I'm not of that.
Sorry?
I'm not of that crowd. So
I know you're not.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many alternative researchers, that's one of the reasons why they cannot grasp Chris's work, is because they have separatist thinking, and they think that if people are highly developed metaphysically or spiritually, then they'd have no need for technology. But that's nonsense.
Well, some of the most fun discussions we've had is technology. Does it have to be evil? Couldn't it really be good? And can you find models of nature for technology? And is the human animal just built in order to produce technology? Is this just our fate? You know, birds build nests, and other animals, anthills, they build some interesting structures. You know, it's just part of our output. And why can't we do it in a way that is aligned and harmonious and born of spirit? Why can't spirit manifest in our lives through the things that we build and do in our activities? And wouldn't that be this golden age that we all harken back to, some distant memory? Because I think at one point we achieved it. Was it as tangible as looking at the Giza pyramid as a power plant, as a remnant of this technology? That's so intriguing. Mm-hmm. Can we learn that lesson and apply it today?
I think so, and I think we're heading in that direction, because if you look at the industrial landscape today, especially in England and Europe, and you look at how we practice our commerce and technology and manufacturing today, I mean, if you look into history and make a comparison, there is a huge difference in how workforces are organized and how workforces are managed, and how technology is applied. And it's always, throughout the years, there's been a tug and pull kind of, a pull-push kind of relationship between a liberal and conservative. You know, you've got the big business on one side, the liberal on the other side. They want to save the earth, and business wants to make a profit. But I think the results of that have been, industry has been charged with responsibilities to improve their technologies in terms of making them more ecologically friendly. And also the laws that are applied to industry and to management as they manage a workforce have made them more social. They've given them more social consciousness in terms of how they treat their employees. So it is leading towards that golden age. It's certainly far from it, but
we're on the upswing, though.
Vast improvement over what it was. We no longer send 10 and 12-year-old kids down the mines, and
So
some spirit is whispering in all of our ears, saying there is a better way, and here's the inspiration to see the pieces of the puzzle, to piece it together, and to put it back on the table that it's a viable opportunity. Engineers only build what you demand of them, and there are so many ways of getting to the same goal. Physics is very pliable. There are secrets yet to be discovered.
And again, this returns to my work. The indigenous wisdom keepers of Egypt are saying that we're coming to an end of a cycle and going into another cycle, a dawn of consciousness. So therefore, you're going to have, instead of the dichotomy of technologists, engineers on one side, theoretics or metaphysics on the other side, that they are going to come back together because that's how it was. So the golden age in the past can be again. And these two gentlemen that we're speaking to are a perfect example. John Cadman, Chris Dunn, very practical engineers who are very spiritual men. And this is where the future is.
So enough philosophy. I want to understand and take it from John describing how this resonant pulsed energy being put through the water in the subterranean chamber then ends up to hydrogen and microwaves and the rest of it. Let's understand this technology. So I'll start with you, John, and then we'll switch over to Chris when it comes to his design. Okay?
Well, the basic pulsing is really quite simple.
And we talked about that. And you said the gas would just naturally accumulate on the surface of the water.
And then it would flow to the tunnel going up into the Queen's chamber.
So the Queen's chamber would fill with hydrogen. Where would the oxygen go?
Now, that's a good question. And truly, my next project I'd like to do would be to actually build a model which was made out of limestone and have the same electrical properties. The models that I have right now are made out of epoxy and fiberglass and glass, and truly I'm not able to prove beyond a shadow of doubt that it produces the hydrogen and oxygen. And I'd like to build a working model which actually starts pumping it out so I can analyze which gases are being released.
Okay, limestone's absorbent, isn't it? Tell me about the properties of limestone and how this would work. Does it have any bearing on,
Well, it's electrically conductive. It's also it acts as a contaminant within the water system, and
adding salts and stuff. You mean?
No, just any sort
calcium?
Any sort of contaminants within the water, within like the subterranean chamber, allows for the electrolysis because pure water does not conduct electricity.
Okay.
By the means of it flowing, it allows for that reaction to occur. And so it's critical to have the same sort of components, same contaminants.
Okay. So you also have an electrical component here, and the whole draw a little triangle, and this pyramid's kind of vibrating, all of it, because of the pulsing of this water. This water pulse is strong enough to get this entire, however many ton structure vibrating softly, right?
Correct.
What give us a beat. What kind of beat are we talking about? How quick is it?
Well, the model runs about it's about 100 beats per minute. But
that's fast.
But the full scale thing would a lot of it would depend upon the wastegate assembly, which is the valve down by the Sphinx. As far as its
how do we know that there was a valve by the Sphinx? What's the evidence for that? You mentioned a waterway. Water could get there, but what kind of a valve are you envisioning?
It's incredibly simple in that it encompasses one moving part, probably a rectangular granite or basalt block, probably 4 by 4 by maybe 6 foot.
Okay.
And it would just move within a shaft.
Now, I want to ask both you and Chris this. Do you think that there were people that had to go in and daily set registers, work inside the pyramid, go in and out, or was it really a hands-off machine once it was set up and working?
There has to be access.
Pardon?
Yeah, hands off, no access.
No access? I think there was access to an area just above the dead-end shaft.
Okay.
I think down into the descending passage, the subterranean chamber would be accessible.
Mm-hmm.
The upper chambers would not be accessible.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And there is evidence that there may be other chambers that led into the subterranean chamber for this accessibility.
Oh,
So again, there may have been some tunnels that were not filled with water that were for the so-called engineers to go in and adjust if necessary.
Mm-hmm. And John, what else do you want to tell us before Chris then describes the rest of the upper part of the pyramid and his theory as to how that worked?
Oh, a couple things. One of the nicest things about this particular assembly, the subterranean chamber and descending passage,
can you speak up?
Is that probably one of the most interesting things is that it's in the dead-end shaft. It would be easy. It'd be very easy to tune the pulse rate of the whole whole assembly.
Okay.
Just by having a basic gate-type valve, by restricting the flow by a gate valve. At the end of the dead-end shaft, it would alter the timing to compensate for water temperature, atmospheric temperature. It'd be extremely easy to do.
Okay, so there were checks and balances along the way. That's what I was getting at. How do you keep the thing tuned perfectly? If it's so powerful, you need to keep it perfectly in tune, and this is how you do it. Okay.
I believe that would be tuning for to create a standing wave in the tunnel going from the pit out to the Sphinx area.
Okay. And what else do you want us to know?
I think that's the extent of it up to Chris's work.
Yeah. Boy, thank you. Thank you, John. Chris, where does it go from here? Say that you got that hydrogen that you based your theory on up into that Queen's chamber, then what?
Yes, speaking to the tuning, except for any fine-tunement in the subterranean chamber, the mass and the materials of the pyramid would determine the tune, the frequency that it would vibrate at, and there would be no variation. So there would be no. It would be like if you create a bell, and every time you strike that bell, it rings at the same frequency. It puts off the same frequency.
You just need to strike it so that it does put off the correct frequency.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's where the tuning comes in. Yeah. Okay.
Right, and so it is tuned as it is being created, and then thereafter there needs to be no more tuning.
Right.
We're talking about the gas, the hydrogen, and the Queen's chamber, as I noted in my book, has when the early researchers went into the Queen's chamber, they found it's encrusted with salt, and it was up to an inch thick.
And this would be from the limestone?
And it's
the water
bleached from the
dissolved?
limestone, and it was the only area within the Great Pyramid that had such a buildup of salt. They found salt in the horizontal passage leading to the Queen's chamber, and they also found some salt in the subterranean chamber too. But the Queen's chamber had the heaviest buildup of salt.
So this is what John was saying about the overflow. Water would get up in there and then drain back down and create this circuit, right?
Yeah, well, I guess I had a different system working.
Oh, let's hear it.
And that was that they were introducing two chemicals, one from the northern shaft and the other from the southern shaft, because there are characteristics on the limestone on each of the shafts that is different.
That are different. Ah.
Yeah. And the southern shaft, which was explored in 1993 by Rudolf Gantenbrink and the Upuat-2 rover, showed a heavy erosion in the lower part of the shaft. And as the robots climbed the shaft up to the so-called door, where there were two copper fittings, the walls of the shaft are smoothed out. I should note for the listener that this shaft is only about 8 inches square. So the discovery in 1993 seemed to support my contention that they had a liquid in this shaft, because it was closed on both sides. Originally, when the pyramid was built, the shaft did not connect entirely with the chamber. It terminated 5 inches away from the inside wall.
And there was a little door at the end that could be raised up, apparently with a copper fitting.
Well, nobody has ever demonstrated that it could be raised, and the door, I believe, is a misnomer.
Okay.
I believe that it was actually a plate, if you will, of limestone, and it was used to just for the purpose of having the copper inserted into that shaft, and so that they would have a kind of a switch in that area, so that when the shaft was filled with a liquid, there would be a connection, and when the water or the chemical dropped below the level of the electrodes, then there would be a disconnect, and they would call for more chemical to be pumped in. Now that's just a preliminary
Brilliant
theory.
And let's take a break, and we'll continue with Chris Dunn, John Cadman, and Stephen Mehler. I'm Laura Lee. Let's continue our conversation with Stephen Mehler in studio, Chris Dunn on the phone, and John Cadman on the phone. And you're describing, Chris, how you believe that Gantenbrink's tunnel, 8-inch square tunnel, was filled with the liquid. And Stephen, you were mentioning that.
Well, in fact, I think it was Chris who told me this. We know that Dr. Zahi Hawass, who is now the chairman of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, he's been promoted within the last year. So not only does he control all archaeology on the Giza Plateau in Saqqara, but he controls archaeology throughout Egypt now, has promised that there's going to be a live showing on American television of what's behind Gantenbrink's door. Now, we're all anxious to see that, because since 1993, when the slab that Chris describes was first discovered, he's been promising for years that he was going to go behind the door and reveal it to the world. And
how do you go behind an 8-inch, tube at the end of this tunnel? There's this little door. Do you have to go from the outside of the pyramid to shift your way through, or what?
Yes, as you mentioned before, when the pyramid was closed, and I actually got in the pyramid in 1997 and 1998 when it was closed to the public, and we saw distinct evidence that there was some other activity going on in the Great Pyramid besides just a new ventilation system, which was why it was closed. So there is a belief that from the first chamber above the king's chamber, they have tunneled downward to behind, supposedly, Gantenbrink's door, and that they can go in that way. We don't know.
What do they expect to find?
Well, I'm sure Zahi Hawass would love to find evidence of Khufu's burial there. But since it's an 8-inch square shaft, what kind of evidence could that be?
Yeah.
Scrolls, statue, whatever. But Chris has an interesting take about what's behind.
It's a liquid
but he also has,
tube
he should
to feed into this.
Yes,
yeah.
He can describe how he thinks it goes. Chris, tell us what you think's behind the stone in Gantenbrink's door.
Well, in the book, I speculated that there would be a shaft that went vertically to a bedrock chamber underneath the pyramid. Since I wrote the book, I was on the Giza Plateau. Actually, it was the same year Stephen and I were doing our research. And to the east of the Great Pyramid, there is a vertical shaft, and a very interesting shaft that has a vertical shaft with some horizontal shafts running off of it. I hadn't noticed that before. And then also on the southern part of the Great Pyramid, there are similar vertical shafts going down into the bedrock. So I kind of changed my speculation on the bedrock chamber underneath, and I think it's entirely possible that what they were doing was providing the fluid for the king's chamber from the outside of the pyramid, and using these shafts on the outside that eventually connected with the a vertical shaft that went to the shafts that led from the Queen's chamber. Now, the interesting thing about that is that there was a French engineer, Professor Carousel, who had detected a vertical anomaly, when he was doing some sounding in the descending passage, and also the horizontal passage, indicating that there was some kind of a regular void that was actually through the pyramid and also through the bedrock, which gives me cause to believe that there is a vertical shaft on the other side of the so-called door.
Now, we've long heard rumors of yet-to-be-discovered chambers and shafts in the pyramid. What does Hakeem say about this?
This is an interesting point. He's mentioning Professor Jean Cadasol, and I have just gotten an email from a French gentleman who's interested in some work in the Great Pyramid, that the French did apply for more permits to do sonic work in the Great Pyramid to find anomalous chambers, and Dr. Hawass pulled the plug on it. So Hakeem says, yes, there are other chambers in the Great Pyramid, and there are tunnels and different ways going. He's saying there's much more yet to be discovered in the pyramid itself as well as outside. And it's also interesting that Chris mentioned the shafts outside. Egyptologists tend to explain that as trial passageways for building the Great Pyramid. That before they built the pyramid, for the descending chamber passageway and the ascending passageway, they did trial runs drilling through the limestone.
Yeah, like you're going to build a solid structure and then put the chambers inside after the fact.
That's right.
Chris,
Stephen, these shafts were different than the trial tunnels.
I know, and we discovered it. You and I, you discovered that yourself in 1999.
Yeah. The casing stones are missing, and who knows what kind of, we were talking about this earlier, apparatus might have been attached to the pyramid via those casing stones. We'll get to that, but who knows what kind of containers there on the outside of the shaft, what it looked like, what other devices. Chris, go ahead. So you think that putting some sort of chemical, the evidence of which you can still see on the sides of those shafts, the chemical composition, into water, into hydrogen?
What I proposed, and I know that Stephen has a different view in terms of how, and he draws on the work of Victor Schauberger, on how water combined in a certain way can create hydrogen. I know that there's electrolysis of water to create hydrogen, and certainly the electrodes at the top of these shafts leading to the Queen's chamber could be more than just switches. I allow that there could be a lot more than what what my understanding is, or what my beliefs were. But what I base my theory on, or hypothesis, was that the buildup of salt on the inside walls, the existence of the plate, the unfinished part of the shaft that didn't come through into the chamber, and also the buildup of gypsum inside the shaft itself, where you would have a certain amount of leaching of gypsum when hydrochloric acid would interact with limestone. And also the salt on the wall would be the result of hot hydrogen, which would boil off after the two chemicals combine. There would be a chemical reaction which would result in hydrogen boiling off, and that hot hydrogen on the limestone would create the buildup of salt. So that is basically what I when I was doing my research, I limited myself to explain in the best way possible the evidence that was in the Queen's chamber. And I'm certainly open to consider other possibilities.
Well, as I discuss in my book, there definitely seems to be evidence for what Chris is saying. So I speculate that somehow they may have substituted chemicals for the water for whatever reason, whether the water sources dried up, they didn't have the adequate supplies anymore, and it could be that at the very end of the function of the Giza power plant that chemicals were substituted, because Chris does have there is some validity for Chris's work with the salt on crustaceans. But again, my whole purpose is the indigenous teaching that Hakim speculated two things for me to work on in my research: sound and water. Mm-hmm. The use of sound, the use of sound for healing at Saqqara, the use of sound to produce the fields to overcome gravity, to lift the stones, and water as the source of the energy. So Hakim was always adamant that water played the key role as the source of the energy originally. But again, it's not an either-or thing here. Chris could be right in that chemicals were eventually substituted for the water. But again, now John Cadman's work is supporting the water, that believes he can demonstrate the water produced the pulsed energy, produced the hydrogen gas. That was the initial source of energy for the Giza power plant.
I would like to say that I'm sure it provided the pulse. I'm not certain about the hydrogen, and Chris could be certainly right. I know it provided the pulse.
Thank you for pointing that out.
That's great. Again,
what we're sure of and what we're just speculating, it's important to
my emphasis was Hakim's insistence on the primacy of water.
But even if you add a few chemicals to the water, it's still primarily water.
And it's possibly the chemicals could have been substituted. There could have been a desire for more power, for more energy.
Chris, I want to hear your scenario played out here of what do you do with hydrogen? What's so special about hydrogen, the most abundant molecule, atom, material, element in the universe?
Yes,
Why is
it
that
is.
important?
And they say, it's the most basic element. It has one proton, one electron, and it's the most plentiful element in the universe. The reason why hydrogen resonates with me, if you'll excuse the pun, but it's because it does resonate with the universe, and it also the frequency resonates with the Great Pyramid.
So it seems to be designed for hydrogen because it's designed around the same wavelength.
Because of the wavelength,
that hydrogen
exactly.
has. Okay.
And it's that wavelength that we find in the King's Chamber.
What is the wavelength?
It's 21 centimeters, 8.309 inches. And that wavelength we find in the northern shaft in the King's Chamber. This shaft pierces the pyramid structure and comes in on an angle from the northern face with a few bends, and then it enters into the King's Chamber. The dimensions of the shaft are 8.4 inches and 4.8. And so when we look at dimensions that would be suitable for a waveguide, because to carry microwave energy, which is electrical energy, electromagnetic energy, but to carry it, you would not use a solid wire. You would use an open waveguide, and the dimensions of the waveguide would be the width would be the wavelength, and the height would be rectangular shape. The height would be approximately half the wavelength.
Okay, so if you're pulsing hydrogen, you've got microwave? How do you get... Where do you get microwave?
Okay. When hydrogen is pumped to a higher energy level, the electron moves to a higher orbit. I'm trying to explain it as simple as possible. That electron, which circles the atom, circles the proton, the electron it's like a spot on a balloon, if you will.
Okay.
Okay, so you're pumping energy into the hydrogen, just like you are blowing up a balloon.
And the pumping energy is because the whole pyramid is resonating.
Because the whole, the pyramid is resonating,
vibrating.
but also there is other activity going on inside the King's Chamber.
Mm-hmm.
And in the King's Chamber, what you find is a structure that is quite remarkable. Your previous guest, John Reed, talked about the acoustics of the King's Chamber. These are critical. Tom Danley, in 1996, I believe, determined that the King's Chamber is still resonating at an F-sharp chord.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have is an acoustical phenomena within this chamber, but we also have a chamber that is constructed entirely of granite. And granite has different properties, electrical properties, than the limestone, which comprises the bulk of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
The granite is comprised, this particular granite is from Aswan, which is 500 miles away, and that could be a topic of another conversation.
Mm-hmm. Why bother to bring it in?
How they quarried the thousands of tons of granite and brought it 500 miles down the Nile. You know, some of the blocks weigh 70 tons or more. But the granite is comprised of 55% silicon quartz crystal. And also, when you look
silicon
at
quartz crystal,
computers,
radio,
electricity.
It's actually called rose quartz granite because it's rose quartz.
But the structure above the King's Chamber is probably the most remarkable structure that you will find. And what we have are 5 layers of these giant granite beams. They're 27 feet long. They weigh up to 70 tons each, and there's over 43 of them.
So if you were looking at it as a technology, what would you describe it as?
Well, some people look at it and they think of dielectric resistors or capacitors or something of that nature. What I see it as is just an amplification chamber where each beam is tuned to a specific frequency that is in harmony with the frequency of the chamber itself.
So you get overtones and you get a whole range? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What's important about overtones?
You can take a frequency at a lower frequency, and then through a series of harmonic steps, you can raise that frequency higher and higher. And so this process was occurring constantly within not just the Grand Gallery, but in the King's Chamber and above the King's Chamber, because that energy would transfer from one of the beams to the next level and all the way up the series of beams to the top.
Okay.
Just like the piano string.
So you wouldn't lose energy as it's traveling. You're actually amplifying it and expanding its bandwidth.
Well, if it's tuned to the same frequency as the forcing frequency, if the medium is tuned, now we'll call the beam a medium. If that's tuned to the same frequency or a harmonic of that frequency, of the forcing frequency, then it will maximize absorption of the energy. And then it will vibrate in sympathy with the forcing frequency. And so what you have then is a mighty transducer. And you talked about Casey early on, and you talked about the mighty crystal. And I read a little
about the mighty crystal.
Yeah. What we have inside the Great Pyramid is a mighty crystal. And but it was done with natural materials. And there has been absolutely no explanation to satisfy the evidence when it comes to explaining why they had 5 layers of beams. They call them relieving chambers.
Oh, for the pressure. You don't go to all this work without a very good reason for it.
They don't relieve any pressure.
Chris has been the first engineer to actually write in print to state that those 5 chambers are redundant if you're calling them relieving chambers. As he's going to say, they're not relieving the pressure.
Maybe they're placed such so that they do help the structure hold together. I don't know. But they also would serve as what you're talking about, the tuning fork.
They don't have any structural benefit at all.
Okay, let's get that on the table.
Okay.
They're not relieving chambers.
Not relieving chambers.
Maybe when they were building the pyramid and they didn't have any porta potties, but I don't think.
So you're saying a transducer, it's taking the resonance and the power and it's putting it into this chamber of hydrogen? It's
Yes.
tuning the hydrogen.
So,
And let's also define what is a crystal. A crystal is any matrix that's regular and that has energy flowing through it in a particular fashion, right? What are the properties of crystal? Crystal, we think of liquid crystal matrices, and, you know, we can expand our definition of a crystal beyond its crystal.
yes, I mean, quartz crystal is known to have piezoelectric properties.
What is piezoelectric? What does that mean?
Well, it's a conversion of or transducing one energy to another energy. In other words, if you excite a crystal mechanically by compressing it, alternately compressing it, it will produce electricity.
It produces a coherent electrical charge.
And likewise, if you put an electric charge on a crystal on a certain axis, it will produce sound.
You know, the universe is very adept at using and transmitting and receiving energy. So are our bodies. We just have to kind of catch up here to the concept. Nature's been at it a long time.
Yes.
With all of these materials and how easily it flows through physics. Okay.
That's what Pythagoras called the harmony of the spheres. Sound is what is through the universe. If you take the beginning of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. If you just substitute in the beginning was a sound, and the sound was God, that's the basis of creation to a lot of people.
Frequency.
Vibration.
Yeah. Okay, so then what, Chris? So you're transducing this pulse and this amplification of energy into hydrogen. Then it's got this correct wavelength. It's the same wavelength as the hydrogen, so it doesn't lose energy as it goes up and it's being shot out the sides.
What we have
right?
is if we excite the gas within the chamber and then pump it to a higher energy level, just, you know, I was using the analogy of a balloon, then we are setting up the conditions where a stimulated emission of radiation can occur, and what we have essentially is a maser, which is a microwave amplification through stimulated emission radiation.
That's what maser stands for.
And that's what maser stands for.
So
actually, the maser was the precursor to the laser, and I feel sound like Austin Powers now.
and it is believed that Nikola Tesla invented the maser.
But the laser was actually first called the optical maser when it was first invented.
Because it's doing it with light.
With light.
But you could do it with other
microwaves.
emissions from the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay.
So what I envision, you know, there's a lot of materials that I'm missing, but the technology that I envisioned was because of the evidence that's there, because of the dimensions of these shafts, the evidence in the Queen's Chamber, the Grand Gallery.
Brilliant.
What we had was a hydrogen in this chamber that was being pumped to a higher energy level. Then we looked at the northern shaft, and the dimensions of the shaft lead me to speculate that there was a signal coming into the chamber from the northern face, and that signal was actually a hydrogen microwave from the universe. And
because that's the background radiation of the universe at large.
From the Big Bang.
Would there be some sort of collecting device, like a satellite dish, perhaps, on that end?
There could be.
Who knows what was attached to those kidney
yes,
stones?
The sides of the northern face could have been treated, possibly to collect that.
Well, the whole sides are indented slightly, so they're a little bit convex or concave.
Dish-shaped. Yeah.
Dish-shaped, yeah. The whole sides of each.
All four sides.
Yeah.
And so that input signal, if you go from the northern shaft and follow the direction of the northern shaft across the room, in the southern wall, you'll see a large opening. And the shape of that opening is like a horn antenna. And
what is a horn antenna, please?
Well, if you drive down the highway and you look at these communication towers, you'll see some of them have these antennas that are shaped like a catcher's mitt. And those are what they call
What's special about that shape, then? Why does that work?
It collects radiation and focuses it to a small spot. So it takes it over a larger area and then focuses it to a waveguide that is actually a smaller smaller dimension.
So you're saying the north side and the south side were
Entirely different, but
coordinating the transfer.
yes, because once your beam enters, once the microwave beam enters the King's chamber and starts traveling across the room and interacting with other devices that would be in its path to amplify it even further.
Right.
And I think, Chris, we should point out, and this was verified by the workers of Flinders Petrie, that the stone box in the King's chamber is not in its original position, that it was originally between the openings of the shaft, and it has been moved.
That's where I speculate that.
Okay, let's talk about the granite box. It's got, now John Reed was pointing out that its dimensions were also in harmony with the chamber at large. And so what would its function be in this scenario, Chris?
It could have served as some form of amplification.
Do you think it was filled with something?
It could have been filled with something. It could have had something within the box. The interesting thing about these ancient Egyptian boxes is that the precision on the inside surfaces are quite remarkable. It's almost like they were crafted to accept something else, though whatever that something else is not there anymore. But if I take you into the pyramid next door, into Khafra's pyramid, the corner radius is almost a sharp corner in that particular box, in that pyramid. And there's no real reason for that, unless you're putting something in there, because the amount of work it would take to sharpen that inside corner.
Right.
It's
How do you get little pounding rocks to do that? We've got 2 minutes, and I need a summation. Chris, what do you think what they were doing with this, putting a person in the sarcophagus to go, I'm in touch with the universe in a very harmonious way in that background radiation of the universe at large. What were they doing, and how do you get power to operate these tools that created those precise inner corners? 1 minute, and then I've got 30 seconds each for John and Stephen.
Well, I think I relate back to your original comment that the upper chambers were inaccessible and probably inhospitable, too, to any human body because of the energy levels. The power
and chemicals.
Sorry?
And chemicals.
And chemicals. The power coming out of the King's chamber. The interesting thing on the southern shaft goes out of the King's chamber at a 45-degree angle. It crosses the equatorial plane almost at the point where you would park a geosynchronous satellite. And I know that that is really, really far out, and a lot of people are going to, roll their eyes at that. But
you're just making an interesting notation here.
It's an interesting notation.
Make the implications as you will, but you're just noting that.
Just noting that. So
you see a vast array of technology supported by this solid-state machine known as the Giza pyramid.
I see that if they can build a pyramid, if they can craft their artifacts in the manner that they did, there is a lot missing, and it's open to interpretation. And when we look at the how we craft these artifacts today and the level of technology that we have to engage in to craft them, then it does open up a different view of the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Cometians.
And who knows where those tools are, those other apparatus,
think
where they're buried.
I think then we have to look at the time period that the pyramids were built or when the tools were used.
That's where Hakeem comes in.
Yes. If we're looking at tens of thousands of years, then they probably wouldn't have lasted.
So we can explain their disappearance. John, I want to say thank you to you and your comments.
Why, most welcome. I mean, it's good talking to everybody, Chris, Stephen, and of course you, Laura.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Great talking to you too, John.
Yeah, and thanks for your participation here, John, and just the wonderful work that you're doing. Stephen, we sum up with you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for bringing us all together and to be able to present our work to the public. It's a great work that you do.
And I just want to say in the short time remaining, thank you all, and thank you for listening.
Things would be that there's very few good designs of the subterranean chamber, which is
a key part of this.
Yes, it is.
And Chris notes that in your book, Chris.
Yes. in the Giza power plant, the subterranean chamber, I theorize, actually held equipment that drove the pyramid, the entire pyramid, to resonance, and in assistance with some of the other pyramids, actually drove the entire plateau to a vibratory resonance. And what that equipment looked like, I have no idea. I mean, one can speculate, but certainly somebody who actually develops a system, and I believe John has developed a system, and John, you can override me if you want. I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, I actually, back in '99, I had read Chris's book, and had come across part of what his theory was regarding the subterranean chamber creating the pulse, or the pulsing frequency to drive the upper part of the pyramid, something of Tesla sort of nature. And in April of 2000, I finally built a working model of the basic pump assembly of the descending passage in the subterranean chamber. And the one thing I had noticed was that the subterranean chamber was absorbing the vast majority of a hydraulic hammer or a compression wave. And it was sending.
Can you explain what compression wave is and a hydraulic hammer?
Hydraulic hammer is an effect which occurs when moving water is stopped nearly instantaneously, basically the near instantaneous closing of a valve. And when that occurs, the water which is moving at a certain speed stops instantaneously, and when it does that, it compresses the fluid at the valve area, and it reflects back up from the water source. And what I had found was that the subterranean chamber, when it was absorbing the vast majority of this compression wave, and the compression wave has a tremendous force. I've calculated out to be something in the neighborhood of 20.
Welcome to Conversation for Exploration. Hi, I'm your host, Laura Lee. One of the joys of this job over the past 12 years has been hearing from so many researchers in so many different fields to hear in depth their piece of the puzzle that they've been researching, and I sit in a great position here to see pieces being put down on the table in various sectors, and then how all of this grand design fits together, especially in the field of ancient mysteries. Another joy is when some of those researchers get together on this show, and we'll have one such occasion here tonight. 3 of them. 2 of them have met before, almost on this show. They were, I think, next to each other in the guest lineup one night some years ago. That was Stephen Mehler and Chris Dunn. Stephen has been doing work with the indigenous elders of the Giza Plateau, the keepers of that very old line of wisdom, and looking at the underground waterways, long rumored. Finally, the evidence has come in to confirm that, and his new book is called
The Land of Osiris.
Just out. And Chris Dunn, a long-time, frequent guest on this show, joins us again tonight, and his work has been looking for the power source. When Paul and I went to Egypt, we saw lots of evidence of machine tooling. We're not machinists like Chris Dunn is, but even we could recognize that artifacts in the pyramid there, in the museum there, that these were extraordinarily done, not with pounding balls. There was some tools going on there, on beyond copper. These were machined. We could see that. So quickly found out about Chris, invited him on the show, and Chris's book, The Giza Power Plant, explains just how the power source might have been to power some of those tools. Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm fine, Laura. It's a pleasure to be back talking to you.
Good to be back to you. And I understand you and Stephen met and have been collaborating for some time, and you found John Cadman, who's a maritime engineer who also joins us in our four-way conversation here. And John has built a working model of a pump to explain how you get water from deep underground up to the Great Pyramid to then start doing who knows what, and we're going to try to sort some of those pieces out. John, how are you, and thanks for being here.
Hi, Laura. I'm doing really well. It's nice to be here.
So where do we begin with this story? Stephen, you're in studio.
Well, thank you,
set
Laura.
some groundwork.
Thank you, and you deserve a lot of the credit in this first section because, as you mentioned, I became aware of Chris Dunn's work perhaps in the mid-1990s. I think it was an article in Atlantis Rising that he had written on advanced machining, and I met a friend of yours at a
21 million pounds of force, vertical force in this subterranean chamber. So it's a sizable force.
So how difficult would it be to accomplish that? Because that subterranean chamber is very odd. It's rough cut. It's got some sort of wall between it. It looks, and so many people have guessed, there's got to be a very specific purpose to this, but it doesn't look like any technology we're used to seeing. So would it be by specific design to do that? How difficult is it to accomplish that, what you're talking about?
It was a very, very difficult design in that it's a three-dimensional, it's very much a three-dimensional design, and not only does it incorporate fluid dynamics,
Mm-hmm.
it also incorporates acoustical dynamics.
Oh, how so? Can you both explain? All three? Explain that a little more.
Of course, that leads right into Chris's work when you say acoustical dynamics, so go ahead, Chris.
Well, I'm not going to steal John's thunder because, the acoustics, if you look at any sound traveling through any medium, it is vibration. We know it as sound when it strikes our ears. But really, it's a wave that is traveling through a medium, whether it's
through a
water
gas or
a
air.
solid or a liquid.
Okay.
So the properties of the medium and also the dimensions that the medium is contained within would affect the characteristics of the sound or the vibration.
Why is it important to set up a vibration there, and what could it do?
To set up a vibration in the subterranean chamber could potentially cause the entire pyramid to, if that vibration is pulsed at the resonant frequency of the structure, then the structure will absorb that energy. It will maximize the throughput of that energy through the structure. So when you talk about, say, a harmonic resonance, you can actually, it's like a piano strings where you strike one and at an octave higher, another string will vibrate in sympathy. It maximizes the absorption of energy.
Because if you map out a resonant bunch of frequencies, the lows all match up, the highs all match up, and so they're building. That was Tesla's whole principle. If you get them to match up,
exactly,
you build up strength.
Basically, what I was leading to was that Tesla actually demonstrated the effect of this phenomenon, and
leading to earthquake in New York.
Built an earthquake, yeah,
an
earthquake machine, right.
You think, what can a few sound waves do? Well, quite a lot if you engineer it correctly.
Right, and so it's like if you take a huge 1-ton iron ball that's hung from a chain from the ceiling, you go up to it with you calculate how much energy it's going to take to move that ball from point A to point B, say a 3-foot swing. And so you calculate how much energy it takes to overcome inertia and move that mass. You could have a considerable amount of energy involved in the hammer that you're going to use to strike it. However, a child could walk up to that huge ball and just give it a little push, and it won't move very much, but it will move, and then it will move back to her, and then she can push it some more. And so every time the pendulum swings back to that child and energy is applied to it, the ball will swing further. And so with less energy, you can actually affect a greater amount of work by moving the ball further than what you normally could if you were just going to strike it.
There's other indications that resonance was part of the mechanics of this solid-state machine as you've described it, Chris, because the King's chamber is so set for particular resonance. There's so many indications that it was...
Yes. And I understand, too, that you recently had an acoustics engineer, John Reed, on your...
John Reed, fascinating work.
Yes.
He stretched a drum across the sarcophagus, he set up tones, and he found hieroglyphic shapes forming in the sand, a la Hans Jenny's cymatic experiments.
And I haven't, I'm going to buy his book from your bookstore, but I'm fascinated to read his work.
Yeah.
Because I know that in my book, I think from what I read on your website, that he noted that the whole chamber resonated at around 440, and also the granite box. So I call it a granite box. A lot of people call it a sarcophagus,
which is a misnomer.
But that they resonated at 440.
So you have this other chamber above that's geared to accept resonance at a particular frequency and do interesting things with it. We'll get to that in a moment. But you mentioned that it's pulsing at a resonance frequency. And John, how does the pulse happen? Does this valve close on and off so that you get a pulse? Because it's very important to set up a resonance, right?
Right.
Conference in Newark, Delaware, arranged for me to be on a show in November of 1996 with you, and lo and behold, synchronistically on the same night you were interviewing Chris Dunn. And that's the first time I ever heard him speak, and I was very impressed with him and his work. And another synchronistic event, we were invited to be on a closed-circuit TV show in Santa Barbara, California in February of 1997, and that's where we first met. And it was like an instant coming together. I mean, it's like we knew each other in past lives, if people want to go there. And it's just been, since then, we've become great friends and colleagues. And how it all becomes full circle here is Chris was invited to be a director of research of an organization that's formed by Dr. John DeSalvo, who you have interviewed, called the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association. And I then contacted John DeSalvo, and I became a director of research. And he said there was a gentleman that came along on board to be part of an advisory board, and that's John Cadman. And so that brings us all together. We are all on the advisory board of the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association. That's GizaPyramid.com. And now I've come here to a vacation to the Seattle area and have met John. And so now it's all come to circle. And Chris and I have gotten to the point where we've actually done a tour of Egypt together. So we've been in the field in May of 1999, and that's a fantastic adventure to be in the field with Chris Dunn, to be out there and see things through his eyes, to see him point out the machining, to see him point out the artifacts. And our combination of the fact that I am a prehistorian, archaeologist, theorist, and I have provided the cultural context, the greatest criticism that's been applied to a lot of the theories of alternative researchers and Chris's work is there's no cultural context. Where is the culture that could have produced advanced machining or advanced civilization? And through my work with the indigenous elder Abdel Hakim, we now have the cultural context that there was a civilization prior to 10,000 years ago of indigenous people, very sophisticated, highly advanced in science, mathematics, and engineering. And so there's the framework that brings Chris's work out. And Chris's book, The Giza Power Plant, is the first major work that fits right in line with the indigenous teaching.
And John, you're building a working model of Kunkel's pump. I've also been intrigued by the Kunkel pump theory. Now, what's the update on that? Because I kept asking Stephen Mehler, you guys going to build a working model? You know, isn't it easy to put a few things together and get the angles right and get this and see if it works? And I understand you've finally done that.
I put it together. Actually, it's been running for about 2 years, a little over 2 years. And there were some parts of it which were really quite difficult to overcome. And one of the biggest